Hello, and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest newsletter, and my guest today is Dr. Sanam Vakil, director of the Middle East and North Africa program at London's Chatham House. Her focus is on Iranian and Gulf politics, regional security dynamics, and U.S. foreign policy. Sanam, great to have you back in the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
There seems to be a wide consensus among the commentariat that the United States and Donald Trump have lost the war and they've lost it badly, and that therefore Iran has won the war. I don't think you quite see it that way, Sam. In a recent piece you wrote for Chatham House, you called it an unequal draw. Can I get you to drill down on what you mean by an unequal draw?
Sure, happy to elaborate. So, first of all, I share the commentariat's consensus that the US did not prepare strategically for this war. The US administration, laid out a plan for a quick victory, and clearly, after 4 or 5 days, it was abundantly obvious to all of us that this was all going terribly wrong. So, if you look at it in those terms, coupled with the fact that the objectives of regime change, let alone military degradation of the Islamic Republic, were not achieved, yes, the US did not perform very well. And of course, they did not anticipate the most obvious closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So, I share that analysis of the landscape. But the US does still retain cards that it can play. Its US military is still formidable. It still surrounds the region and sits on the other side of the Persian Gulf, and continue to wield economic tools to pressure the Islamic Republic as well. So, take that landscape together. The US didn't win the war. Iran survived the war, but I wouldn't call that a win for Iran either. The only way this becomes either a victory or even a loss for either side, depending on how you look at it, is if they can convert this moment into a meaningful agreement. So to me, this is a draw. The United States still has military leverage and economic leverage over Iran, and the and Iran, excuse me, can still pressure the United States over the Strait of Hormuz. So that's what I mean by an unequal draw.
Yeah, I think you're right about the strength, the might of the American military presence, that should not be disregarded. And equally, the Strait of Hormuz remains a very strong card for the Iranians to play. Um, but yeah, I think the assumption that this was a massive defeat for Trump is perhaps overplayed, and I think you nailed that very, very well. But look, we've seen tit for tat just last week. The Iranians hit a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. responded by hitting what the Pentagon called military targets, and the tit for tat continued over this past weekend. So, Sanam, do you think the ceasefire will hold? And I ask the question because it seems to me to be a trifle reckless for the Iranians to poke the bear, so to speak.
You're quite right to ask this question, Bill, because it does appear that Iran is sitting on a golden opportunity to perhaps negotiate one of a kind type of an agreement with the United States, with a deal maker president, and yet they are behaving in a way that we might assess as irrational. That said, and I do, question the behavior all the time. I do think the ceasefire will hold. It's not a conventional ceasefire. President Trump himself has sort of condescendingly suggested that ceasefires in the Middle East, are different from other ceasefires. And the reason why, we're going to continue to see back and forth and a very bumpy road, I think, for the weeks and months ahead, is because of the trust deficit between Tehran and Washington, because the core areas that they need to negotiate on are actually not only just difficult issues, but they're interconnected. And for Iran, it doesn't want to surrender control over the Strait of Hormuz when the other baskets, such as Iran's nuclear program or sanctions relief or a sustainable agreement, haven't been achieved. So the tit for tat, in my mind, is just going to become part and parcel of this negotiation process.
Mm, that's dangerous, isn't it? Because a tit could become a little too strong, and the tat could go the other way. I mean, oftentimes in these situations, mistakes can be made as well.
Yes, you're right, and the conflicts in the region are very interconnected, and much can go wrong, and there is risk of spillover. But I think for now, both Tehran and Washington have an interest in playing these negotiations out for a third time. The U.S. is gearing up not just for the 250th um, anniversary celebrations in the United States, but Trump is thinking about the midterm elections in November. And so stabilizing oil prices and the economy is at the forefront of his mind. And having a war in the Middle East raging simultaneously, I think isn't a good look, and particularly a war that isn't going great. For the Iranians as well, a pause is also welcome. Again, they've enhanced their leverage. And we need to see if they can actually convert that leverage into a meaningful agreement. I'm not convinced they'll be able to. So that's problematic. But then secondly, this could be a moment where a population, gets some breathing room, and the Iranians themselves, gear up strategically and tactically for the negotiations to fail and the bleaker prospect of further conflict in the region.
Mm. Can I ask you too, just about the Iranian leadership being described as more hardcore than the previous one, the one that was assassinated by Trump and the Israelis? I mean, what can you say about that current leadership?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to watch and read them, as many people are. I don't have strong convictions yet about their ideological direction. Some people see a more nationalist, pragmatic leadership emerging. Others interpret the leaders as still being fierce and ideological. I think the jury is still out. What I do see is a bit more of a consensus-based decision-making structure that is horizontal and less vertical. The current supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is not only injured, but is missing in action. He's not really commanding the Islamic Republic in the way that his father did. And so it's leading to much more negotiation and alignment within the institutions and the key figures. And the key figures are the technical government led by Pezeshkian, the president, but also the Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who's been taking a front row seat in the negotiations. And then on the other side, you have the unelected sort of deep state IRGC institution being, commandeered by Ahmad Vahidi and the folks around him. So I think that balance between these two sides currently is how I'm seeing things move forward. Hardliners have been contained in their opposition for now, and we just have to give this system time to adapt and adjust. It's just been a number of weeks, and I think it's too early to call time on the ideology of the past or the future. I do think that they might be more pragmatic, they might be more motivated by economic interests, but I haven't yet seen evidence that they're able to turn that pragmatism or their economic interests into a tangible deal.
Okay, so a watching brief there. Now Lebanon. Lebanon looms large. Tehran has said the IDF needs to get out of southern Lebanon and Lebanon rather and cease their airstrikes. Netanyahu says we ain't going anywhere and we'll continue to launch what he calls self-defense attacks. Now we have a deal that was signed on Friday by the Lebanese government and the Israelis. Already there are questions being raised about that deal. I'm wondering what you make of it.
This is part of the broader standoff. It's a confrontation between obviously Israel and Hezbollah, but Israel and Iran at the end of the day. And both sides are trying to exert negative influence in a country that, is having its sovereignty violated by two external actors. Certainly, the agreement that's been signed is historic, and there is an opportunity to bolster the Lebanese government and its efforts at negotiating with Hezbollah. But I also don't see this as a smooth or easy process that can be managed or outsourced to Israel and the United States. I think the only way that this can really materialize into a long-term effective agreement is if it's a Lebanese process, not one that is imposed externally. And we're just going to have to see how this all unfolds. Ultimately, Iran is trying to showcase its continued influence in the context of Lebanon, Hezbollah's continued resilience despite Israeli attacks, and for Iran, if it can showcase its influence, that already is a positive outcome in its larger adversarial standoff with Israel.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, Sanam, that Trump, and there is every indication now that he is going to rein in Israel and Netanyahu, because the Republican Party is getting very, very annoyed with the Israelis, to say as well as to say the MAGA movement in general. But can Tehran restrain Hezbollah, or indeed do they want to restrain Hezbollah?
Well, that is a very good question, and one that I think is not static. There have been, moments in the history of the relationship where Iran has much more influence, other moments where Iran has outsourced and allowed, and I think this is more of the case when Hassan Nasrallah was around, much more autonomy. I think there are factions within Hezbollah, those that are more inclined to put Hezbollah's interests first, and there are other factions that see the axis of resistance and the relationship with Iran as more important. For the time being, I think it suits Tehran to have an unrestrained Hezbollah, but there might be a critical moment where a cease and desist order will be enforced, and we'll have to see if and when that materializes.
Yeah, because looking at the Iraq, and the broad assumption made that Tehran controls the militias there, that's not necessarily the case. There are strong nationalist interests in Iraq, even among the militias, that say, no, no, we don't let Tehran just simply pull our strings. We're not puppets. Is it fair to take the same view with Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah is an indigenous entity that Iran, of course, has instrumentalized and supported and bolstered its capacity, and used effectively for its own purposes. So, much like the militias in Iraq, which are also not homogenous, but we should see as factionalized and has degrees of loyalty and ideological fealty. We can't look at them all in the same way and paint them all with the same brush. And that this all matters because if you want to unravel the relationships, and even if you can imagine a day where Iran decides to wash its hands of these proxies and partners, will these groups, can disappear, or are they going to still remain within the national context? I think it's very much the latter, but they could develop, other relationships, be them regional or internal.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East North Africa Program at London's Chatham House. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Sign up, and you receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. Let's look at the Gulf states. The Gulf states are on the front line in this war. The UAE, which has been heavily hit, indeed much more harder hit than Israel, has moved from backing the Israelis to joining its GCC neighbors and calling for an end to the conflict. How urgently do the UAE and the other GCC states need the war to be over with? And I suppose what will they need to hear that will convince them that the security they had before the war is returning?
Well, it's a real shame the GCC have been on the front lines of a war that they lobbied against. Clearly, their influence did not bear fruit with the Trump administration. They've been damaged economically, reputationally, and there's a reason why there is a collective effort underway in and across the Gulf states to end this war. I do think the war for now is over, but again, Gulf states are very worried that there will be continued spillover, as we saw over the past few days, where Kuwait and Bahrain were struck after the U.S. struck Iran, and this tit for tat is going to dampen the economic environment, investment climate, impact air travel, tourism, and of course, fundamentally, the economic cost of this war is going to be huge, not just for energy and shipping, but spread far and wide. So they're playing a very important diplomatic role in supporting the negotiations. And I think that they will be guarantors of this agreement. What they do worry about, though, is like in previous rounds of negotiations and in the JCPOA time with Iran, that their issues aren't going to be addressed, that there is not going to be any discussion on ballistic missiles or drones, and there's not going to be any discussion on Iran's long-standing policy of supporting the axis of resistance groups in the region.
Yeah, so that's the issue of security, and also you touch on the fact that previous negotiations they were just left out. They may have a little more clout this time around, but in the longer run, I think the insecurity will continue. And is it the right approach for the GCC to try and make peace with Iran separately from whatever Donald Trump comes up with?
I think that's inevitable, even though there's deep anger across the GCC with Iran for these just unprovoked attacks that were so severe, particularly on the UAE. Gulf states are being quite pragmatic about the way forward. They recognize that geographically they are bound to Iran, and engaging, managing, and using what leverage they have is necessary because the current dynamics of tit for tat instability is going to continue to weigh heavily on the domestic and regional economic and security environment.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Palestine has not figured in the talks, at least not directly. Given what Israel is doing, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the settler terrorism, does that surprise you at all?
No, it doesn't surprise me, to be very direct. I'm incredibly disappointed and worry very much about Palestinians being neglected and ignored as a result of this war. And in advance of the Israeli elections, it very much appears that the Israeli government's objectives are to, permanently separate not just Gaza from the West Bank, but, divide the West Bank and make this idea of a Palestinian state impossible to achieve in terms of territory. But, ultimately, what is needed, I think let's try to be as constructive as possible. There needs to be much more public and policymaker pressure from Europe and from the Arab world on this issue. Leaving it to the sidelines is dangerous. That's how we got here to begin with. And without collective European, British, and Middle Eastern prioritization of Palestine, I do worry that over the next few months, the Netanyahu government are going to push forward in their, devastating plans of ethnic cleansing and continued terrorism.
Yeah, I share that concern with you, Sanam, and also that, the UK government needs to be doing and saying much more, as do the Europeans, as do countries like Canada. I suppose there's an opportunity if Trump could be pressured to get the Americans to take something of a stand on Palestine, although I'm not holding my breath on that one. Um, but look, a final question then. What does a deal look like? And are you optimistic that it can happen?
I would like to be optimistic. The 5% of idealism left inside of me looks at the terrain of the region and looks at the pain and suffering all around. And I hope that all of this trauma and war can be translated into a deal. But I'm not confident that we're going to get there. This is a very transactional moment for policymakers. President Trump is a transactional president. And the transactions are not tied to a sort of transformational vision, if you will, for the region. You need an end game. You need something that you're working towards. And without that sort of vision, I fear that these transactions and these MOUs, are just going to be further itinerations of conflict management rather than translated into political settlements. So, in short, I'm not terribly optimistic. I do think we all know what a deal with Iran would look like. There are experts and policymakers that have discussed and worked and lobbied for this for decades now. The Strait of Hormuz could return to the status quo ante if the nuclear concessions are tied with sufficient incentives and guarantees that this will be a permanent framework. But if all of those baskets are not connected, we could easily find ourselves back for a round three with further damage, destruction, and death across the region. And so, that's a bit of my pessimistic or cynical fear of, what could be on the horizon.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too that the Israelis, as ever, they're a very dangerous wild card. And of course, it seems like the ballistic missile issue has been left off the table. That's a concern for the Gulf states as well as Israel. Um, do you think Israel would act unilaterally? Is that a danger?
I don't see Israel acting unilaterally. While I do think that Prime Minister Netanyahu would like to show its unilateral capabilities, I think the risks are far too great. This was a unique war where Israel, rode side saddle with the United States and demonstrated its capabilities, but it's still dependent on the United States for, much of its security. And so it would be far too dangerous. The optimistic thing I would say, though, Bill, is that regional countries, particularly in the Gulf, but also Turkey and Egypt and Pakistan, are thinking a bit more pragmatically and long term. They do recognize that this almost 3 years of conflict in the Middle East since October 7th has been deeply dangerous, that you can't paper over conflicts. It leaves them to fester, that perhaps this is a moment to talk about sovereignty, non-aggression, that no, probably it's unlikely that Iran is, going to resign or renounce its ballistic missile and drone program. But if their commitments laid out on non-aggression and non-interference, that could be the beginning of a pathway to regional security based on trust, behavior, and investment. It's again very idealistic, but it is the right way to be thinking.
Well, Sanam, let us hang on to that slender ray of hope. Idealism, it may be, but certainly something needs to happen to change what is going on right now, and hopefully what can be avoided in the future. In the meantime, thanks again for talking to me.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Hope you stay well.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at London's Chatham House. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East, North Africa. You'll have noticed we bring you the podcast with no sponsors and no advertising. It's the same for our daily newsletter. We are supported only by our subscribers. We are an independent voice. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. There you'll find a team of experts, contributors like Sanam, covering developments in the Middle East with outstanding analysis and sharp insights. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.